All right, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're streaming in from. Welcome to the webinar, How to Build a Great Cybersecurity Program Within a Budget. We are excited to kick off today. Those of you who are joining us, this is the issue, right? Is there are limitations in life, and we're excited to put forth two budgets with Kelly and Jason who are on today. And this is really to unpack something I think every organization has to deal with is they're given a heavy load, go and protect the network, and they're usually constrained and confined by some sort of budget. And so this is a practical toolkit, a breakdown of how to do that within a budget. So we're going to have some great things for you. And we also have a cool giveaway at the end, so stick with us. We'll have a time for a Q&A as well, but we'll kick it off. So just what we're going to cover today, I'm going to introduce the two speakers. I'm going to go over a few ground rules for this webinar in this scenario. And we're going to talk about overlaps and differences after Jason and Kelly break down their budgets, how they would allocate the money. We're going to talk about some key considerations, things to think through. We'll summarize everything with what did we just talk about, then we'll have our giveaway, and then we'll have a time for Q&A. So if you have questions, we'll have a time there where you can raise your hand with the Zoom feature, and we'll put you off mute and you can ask your questions to either of the speakers for an open dialogue. So from there, we'll dive right in. So Jason Miller is one of the speakers today. He's the founder and CEO of BitLyft Cybersecurity. BitLyft is focused on helping people optimize their security platforms, namely SIEM, so that people can see and detect threats and remediate those in real time or before they even happen. And Jason can explain a little bit more about how they do that as we get to the end. Kelly is also here today. He is with Global Data Vault, which is a disaster recovery as a service company. He's a service delivery manager there, has seen a lot of experience in the industry as well. And Global Data Vault is a Veeam partner. They're one of the sponsors. They're a platinum partner. Sorry, I didn't want to forget that because I know there's different tiers, but they're also a sponsor of today's webinar as well. Wanted to mention them. So from here, we'll get started. This is something, you know, as I kicked off the webinar, why are we here, right? Why are you on this webinar? The why. And this is something we're seeing in real time. And Jason and Kelly, it's interesting, are both going to share some stories of what's happening with some clients right now. Just even, you know, kind of back channels or what you're seeing in the front of the news hitting the headlines as ransomware is on the rise. It is full blown happening. And they've got some really interesting case studies they're going to share. But cyber risk management, this is the key question. How do you manage your risk of cyber threats? And it's based off of resources that are allocated to do that. You know, it's not just say, hey, go and do this, protect our network. What resources, tools, money, people are being applied to that really determines an organization's level of risk and what they're willing to tolerate, what they're willing to put up with, and how they're addressing those issues. So a quick disclaimer, and I'll get into this company that you can use as an example. This webinar and these budgets are not going to cover every scenario. So you know, your industry may be different, your organization may be different. You may say, hey, you know, we're low on employees, but we're high on infrastructure, and so our budget looks a little bit different. Or you may say the exact opposite. You may say, hey, I'm in a really high compliance environment like CMMC, or I have to match the NIST framework. You know, there's a bunch of different swaths of industries and conditions to this. So we get that, we understand that. We're picking one in a general budget in the general company. And this is where you can, even at the end, weigh in your specific questions to your industry. Say, hey, if I'm this, what would you do in this scenario? We understand too, another disclaimer is that implementing is its own challenge. It's not like Kelly or Jason are saying, hey, go do this, and then not realizing the work that goes along with it. It's easy to say, hey, go implement, or it's easy to say, go implement MFA, multi-factor authentication. It's not so easy to actually go and do that, especially if you have 1,500 employees and they don't listen to you and they don't use the technology. There are a lot of challenges with that. We get that, right? But it also doesn't negate the fact that should it be done just because it's hard, and the timeline for that. And Jason and Kelly will get into that as well. The other thing is this is just a framework. It's just a starting point. It's a discussion of how, if you had a limitation of a budget, how would you spend the money? And it's just to start the discussion. So with that, I'm actually going to kick it over to Kelly after I first explain the methodology of this company. So here it is, all right? So we're calling this Acme organization. They're a company that has gross revenue of $250 million. That's their gross revenue annually. Their IT budget is 5% of the gross revenue. So that's 12.5 million is what they've allocated for their IT. And their cybersecurity budget is a percentage of that IT, not of gross, but of the IT, coming in at 625,000. All right. One of the disclaimers in this too is that this does not include headcount. If it included headcount, that would blow the budget, as Kelly will share with you as well. And for frame of reference, so you don't think that we just like pulled these numbers out of anywhere, you know, we pulled some of our own clients at BitLyft of what their budgets were and how they were allocating resources. So we got some real-time feedback. Kelly was able to do the same. And then I pulled in two other sources, so you don't just think this is Global Data Vault and BitLyft saying this, but a statistic from Deloitte in the financial services. They spend about 10% of their IT budgets on cybersecurity, so high regulatory environment. And then the higher education industry or sector, typically, and this is according to Times Higher Education, backed by Educause, you can look into this as well, spends about 3.6%. So that's on like the lower end of the spectrum. So we went into 5%. That's the percentage we chose. So like I said on the outset, if you're falling somewhere in the middle of here, or you're like, hey, I'm at 15%, or you're at 2%, or maybe you don't even know, but this is a good question to go and ask your CFO or your CIO or your leadership is, hey, how much money are we allocating? How does that look from a percentage? And now you've got some baselines to say, hey, we fall low or high on that. So that's the company. And from here, Kelly, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick off your budget.
All right, thanks. So I'm not a CIO, a CISO. You know, I do have experience with IT and with cybersecurity. I came at this a little bit of not knowing every nut and bolt that goes into building a cybersecurity infrastructure, but more of a higher level plan. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my thought that went into this. And part of this, as Nicholas just mentioned, you know, the mindset of public sector, specifically the higher ed, they do have lower budgets. And a lot of times bad actors will attempt to take advantage of this, knowing that people may have outdated security measures or budgets that aren't able to conform with today's standards. And so they'll go after those. You know, we've seen a lot of state and local governments and school systems and whatnot be hit. So they're particularly sensitive to that type of thing. One of the things that I took into consideration with this is a measure of compliance. You know, how do organizations monitor and log their environment? Anything that goes across the environment, whether it's user access or penetration attempts. You know, a lot of times we see servers and machines getting sprayed with password attempts or brute force. You know, how do we keep track of all of that effectively and be able to report it? Could go the same for financial organizations as well. You know, they have really tight constraints around compliance. So I felt that a pretty strong portion of the budget, in this instance, would be $125,000, would go to compliance for just that. Typically, when you think of cybersecurity, at least from an older perspective, maybe an old school perspective, is that firewall, is the perimeter. And today it's not just the firewall, right? There's deep, you know, packet inspection, anything that comes and goes, looked at. It's not just for blocking and allowing connections anymore, or access to the internet, if you will. And there's a lot of ways that people can get in. And there's a lot of ways that people can get data out too. That's one thing that I think is overlooked is I go into data loss protection a little bit here, but what happens if somebody's leaking data from within your organization? What happens credit card numbers or sensitive information that people might be sending from within your organization? So you have to kind of consider that with the stance that you have. for your perimeter. It's not just, that firewall. Identity and access management, I think, is tricky for anyone, especially with people working from home a lot with, the pandemic. Companies and organizations switching to a more remote only or a remote focused scenario. And the challenge is, how do you manage those people's identities? How do you allow them to have access to what they need to access securely from different locations? How do you safeguard whatever's on, I'm obviously in my home office today. How would I safeguard my company against anything that's in this network? And so that does fall into some perimeter things, but it also falls into identity and access, because am I only allowing this computer to access? Is a computer next to me going to be able to somehow spoof and get on the same network? Likewise, are we using multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication? How do we verify credentials within an organization? People come and go all the time. How are we going to track all of that? So, that's another pretty substantial part of the budget from my perspective, especially when, you could have contractors, third-party vendors, which is where we see a lot of things we call insider threats coming from. How do we manage that? Zero trust is a pretty big thing that we hear in the news, and we'll talk a little bit later about what we hear in the news. With zero trust is the mindset of, if you don't need to access it, you're not going to access it. You can only have access to what you're supposed to and nothing else. And a lot of times we as IT people get a little bit lazy, and we will assign people based on a group, or somebody will just say, Jason is my coworker. Why don't you just go ahead and mirror his access to mine, because we're doing similar things. And before long, that sort of gets spread out across the organization. And now you have somebody with domain admin rights or somebody with elevated credentials who doesn't need to have them. This is particularly impactful when it comes to accessing network resources. So when we think about malware and ransomware and how it traverses a network, it's going to access everything that whatever credentials it's using can access. And that's based generally upon whatever person's identity or credentials that it steals, and whatever the bad actors get access to. So the less trust that you're able to give to people, the better you're going to be. This goes into one of the things, we talked about implementation, or how easy is it to actually roll out. A lot of people will say it's too much of a hassle. I need my people to be able to access the stuff to do their jobs. And well, after you get audited, or after some ransomware hits, and you come back and say, well, did you really need access? And it becomes quite bigger deal at that point. I left a little bit less on that one to 10%, just because, again, it can be an afterthought, but I think people need to bring it up more. It needs to be something that people look at more. And then endpoints. Endpoints are some of the most dangerous things, whether it's your phone, whether you have a mobile device management, whether it's your computers, anything that touches a network from a compute standpoint, basically is an endpoint. And that sort of rolls into the user training scenario, because in any given situation, in any given environment, my opinion is the weakest link is me. The humans, the people. You can pile millions and millions and millions of dollars into your cybersecurity planning and infrastructure, and all it takes is one person to click one link one time, and you've undone pretty much all of that. So having appropriate endpoint protection that will safeguard against the user a little bit. I think Jason's going to go into some better details about automatic script blocking and things like that. But that endpoint piece cannot be forgotten about, or sort of cheaped out on, if you will. So the user training is important. It's got to be ongoing. It has to be mandatory. And viruses, malware, ransomware, the cybersecurity threats change every day. So we need to have constant updates and education to our users. And last but not least, for me anyway, and I didn't mean to put this such quite a little thing, but again, you get into the instance of, I'm thinking through all of these things, and you get to the end and you're like, oh, well, where's the rest of my money? These things are so important that I've already come up with. What do I reallocate to fix it? So data loss prevention, I kind of mentioned that a little bit ago with the credit cards, the sensitive information, somebody stealing your data. There was a famous automotive company that had somebody quit, go work for somebody else, took some data along with them, and it was a big trademark, patent infringement thing that happened because of that. So how do you prevent that? How do you prevent people from stealing your information or threatening to expose it within the organization? So that's sort of how I went at it. Again, that's not going to work for everybody, but I think it's a good starting point. I know Jason's got a little bit more of a breakdown for us with his budget.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. So we're coming fresh off of assisting two organizations that were hit with ransomware. And so we even updated these slides in some of this information as of yesterday to really help bring a real-time sense of where budget dollars should be spent, and just communicating that back and forth with these organizations. So the data that I'm going to share with you here is not only my opinion, but is also the opinion of our clients. And I like where Kelly was going. We talk about firewall and perimeter today. And I think what we'd all say is the perimeter is no longer the perimeter that we would think about it from 10, 15 years ago, where literally everything, servers and data was inside of four walls somewhere. Now how we interact with so many SaaS products and cloud products today, the perimeter really is sort of this, it's this recipe of a mixture of components, right? And that sort of steps into where my line items here of the budget dollars need to be spent. So as we think about that firewall and VPN and perimeters of where we have these pockets of data and pockets of access, pockets of software, and how they interact with each other, I sort of, in my mind, think of like the DNA architecture, right? And the structure of DNA and how it all interconnects. That's a lot like what we're dealing with today. So as we head down that road and we think about how we're so connected today, we need to think about multi-factor authentication. Most organizations today are really on the fence post, either acquiring or have already acquired it and enabled MFA and have spent the money on it, or are thinking about it and they're in the discovery process. Do I go with Duo? Do I go with Office 365? Do I go with OneLogin? Do I go with, there's a lot of products out there to go with. And I am not here today saying that you should go with one versus the other. We're simply stating from a category perspective that these should be or could be where your dollars need to be spent, depending on your organization. And then along with that single sign-on, we see a lot of organizations today that need to be spending some dollars on single sign-on and have one place where their credentials are happening from, and to all of the other SaaS applications, the data. And here's the thing is you need one spot where authentication is either successful or authentication fails. It's very important that you have the logs around that and you understand where the authentication is trying to come from and where you're actually successfully authenticating users to. It goes along to the point that Kelly was making about identity, access, IAM, and also having zero trust is we want to verify and validate that user is truly that user, and it's not a criminal acting on behalf of the real user. Endpoint is really today, I mean, it's everything from iPads to laptops to servers to endpoints out in the cloud. Everything that has an operating system today is considered an endpoint, and you need a good EDR solution to help you with that. In an EDR, what you're looking for is something that is not legacy antivirus. You're looking for something that is very much an algorithm-based detection methodology. And the word response here is imperative. It's critical. Not only can you do you need to have a methodology of detection, but you also need to be able to respond to that endpoint if you so choose, meaning take the endpoint offline if you don't like the behavior that it is showing, or maybe disable a process. You need to be able to respond to it, especially when these endpoints that we're dealing with may not be within close proximity of you, especially with everybody working from home, or if it's out in the cloud. And disaster recovery is probably our number one question when a client or a prospect or somebody is just talking to us for the first time over the phone and they say, hey, we've been hit with ransomware. We've got malware all over our systems. Can you help us out? And within the first few questions of our conversation, we ask them, how is their backup and DR situation? When is the last time that they tested their backups? And how much emphasis are they putting on their backups? And then oftentimes we find out that even backups themselves are being shortcut, and the dollars that need to be spent there really aren't being spent there. People are sort of taking it's not going to happen to me, or I have the data backed up, but I don't have the operating system and all of the other environment variables backed up. That's going to come, that's important, because when it comes time to actually restoring, you're not going to restore under the circumstances that you're thinking. This sunshiny day and everything's going to be perfect. You're going to be restoring at 2 a.m. and you're going to be tired. You're going to be irritable, and you're not going to be happy about how you're restoring. And then you're going to be thinking about all of the aspects of the environment variables that you're going to still have to set up once you have data ready to restore. So I can't stress that enough. If you're familiar with security information event management, or SIM, even if you're not familiar with it, the importance of analyzing log collections and having all of your security information in one spot is another important one on the checklist here. The reason why is because out of the two events that we've experienced with organizations in the last 2 weeks, we literally logged into probably 14 different software packages to help the client understand indicators of compromise and indicators of activity that was all security information event related. And it was logs and data that was not coming into the SIM, because during the time of when we were implementing the SIM and we were setting up the system, people on the IT team said, hey, well, we really don't think that that's that important. We're not going to ingest it into the SIM. So they sort of swept it underneath the rug, or didn't really give value to it. But yet, when it came time to do incident response and figure out initial indicators of compromise and how did the threat actor get in, all of a sudden that data was important to us. So that's critical. Network monitoring goes along with SIM. It's actually a building block to SIM. We would really encourage network monitoring to be part of your budget and part of your program. Patch management. Now, I feel like we've been talking about patch management for at least the last 10 to 15 years. But yet at some level, I still run across organizations that don't take patch management seriously. And one of these incidents that I'm talking about that happened about a week and a half ago, the VPN server was not fully patched. The VPN server was out of date. And what had happened was the criminal actors found the VPN server, found that it had known vulnerabilities that they could exploit, and they exploited the VPN server. And once they were VPN'd in, they were able to maneuver around the entire network. And what I would share with you is that if you have a strong patch management program and you adhere to it, you would prevent yourself from having some major headaches. Now, one thing that I do feel like is a little bit more mature in the space today is encryption and SSL certificates. It's probably something that's been around since the late 90s, early 2000s. And I see a lot of folks do spend time here, but it is important because even if a criminal got a hold of the data, I can't stress enough encryption at rest, encryption in flight, and the importance of highly regarded SSL certificates all across your environment. And then, as Kelly already mentioned, data leak prevention and that whole DLP prevention and protection, the methodologies are extremely important there, as well as security awareness training. They're certainly not last but least. And as a matter of fact, this list could be a whole lot longer, but we have a webinar to share at this time with you. And so we don't have all day, but for an exhaustive list, you could always reach out to Kelly or I, and we're happy to talk with you. But this is probably like the top important items that we got from feedback from clients of where to spend their budget dollars.
That's great. And one of the cool things, with our methodology with setting this up was, I tasked you, Kelly, and you, Jason, separately to come up with your budgets. And I think it's really interesting as we get into this section of where did you guys both gravitate to without having, that initial discussion? And then some of the differences, right? Like, where did your brain go that was slightly different than each other's? So could you walk us through just, the importance of the overlaps? I think that's interesting that you both went there. And then talk through the differences of why, there was some differences in terms of how you were thinking about patch management. You broke that out. I'd just be curious to see how you guys both came at this and why we ended up with just slightly different lists.
Yeah, I think for me, the overlaps are more of the standard, if you will, more things that are very common when you think about security or cybersecurity. It used to be, you go and you install your antivirus on all your computers, and everybody had the firewall. And the identity and access management sort of started coming up, and it's pretty much everybody's thinking about it. Training and the data loss prevention, those are the kind of things that you see the videos about, when you start at a company or you have your quarterly trainings where people are sitting around watching the video of what to do and what not to do. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased in the DRAS sector. And I didn't specifically mention that because I know that we were going to have a little bit more of a discussion about it. And, one of the considerations that we'll talk about in a second is who's actually going to pay for that. Does it come out of a cybersecurity budget? Is it spread across departmental budgets for their piece of the pie, if you will? It's definitely something that's a critical component. For the others, it's just, I think, sort of how you think about it. Patch management is definitely a thing that we practice. In addition to the example that Jason gave, there was, I don't remember if it was WannaCry or something else a couple of years ago that preyed on a Windows patch that had been out for like 3 years, that some organizations simply hadn't applied. I may be off on my years there, my dates, but it's those types of things where you don't think about this patch. Well, that was a thing like a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. Surely I don't have to worry about that now. And somebody came back along and said, oh, this is still an issue. And let me go see how many people haven't applied that. So I think the overlaps for me were stuff that was just very top of mind. The differences might be slightly different approaches and how it's all delivered, and the differences in newer technology and things that Jason might be able to explain better.
Yeah, and one of the things that I would stress is I don't want you to walk away from this webinar and say, well, we've got a firewall and we're protected. what I would stress is the up-to-dateness of your firewall, its maturity, making sure that it is actually not because it says it inside the firewall and there's a checkbox for it, but make sure that your firewall and your IAM and your endpoint protection are sort of, I really hate this term because this is such a marketing fluff, but like next generation. But what I would say is that it actually helps solve the challenges of today's modern attacks. So I'll give you an example on the endpoint protection. The endpoint protection that you need to have installed on your systems today needs to be able to help protect against scripts, and it has to have script blocking in place, and that you have to block PowerShell scripts that you have not verified and validated on your network. That is like one of the main things that is causing ransomware to run rampant today on systems, and it's so quick. And it's because a lot of IT systems are sort of stitched together with being able to run PowerShell in the environment. So IT administrators across the clients that we've seen, they say, well, we need PowerShell to run. Well, wait a minute, you only need 15 or 20 PowerShells to run in your environment, not a blanket everything. So when you're looking at these technologies, you need to look at it through the lenses of modern day. Has the software kept up, and has it been rewritten within the last few years to be able to help you protect and solve the challenges that we're fighting today? And then on the differences side, one of the reasons why I put DRAS at the top is because we still are seeing clients that get hit with ransomware. They are trying to restore at midnight, 2 o'clock. It's never at the most opportune time. And they are struggling to restore systems. And it's because they have not tested their backup scenario within the last 6 months or a year, even 2 years. So I can't stress enough that testing your backups, shutting down, have a window, shut your production system down, have a maintenance window, and then fire off a restore and see if you can restore your system from scratch during a maintenance window. And I know it sounds scary, but the even scarier part is that you're going to be forced to do it when you're hit with a ransomware event. And so that's why that one sort of bubbled up to the top is because I'm trying to coach clients and coach people out in the space not to pay the ransom. And in order to do that, you've got to have good backup and recovery systems.
Yeah, that's really good. And one of the things too is I'm going to kick this over to Kelly first, but when we talk about these budgets, right, I'm sure that people watching this are thinking of like 50 things. Well, but this and that. And there are a lot of factors, right? So Kelly, could you walk us through some of these considerations for how you came to this conclusion and things that and you're aware of and that could affect the budget and affect how you ultimately spend the money within that?
Yeah, and that's a tough one. And again, like you said, it's going to really depend on the organization, whether or not you're staff heavy versus technology heavy, that type of thing. One of the biggest challenges when you're implementing cybersecurity, as we've discussed, it's always changing, is who's going to manage it. Are you going to be able to hire or train people to do it? Do you need to bring in somebody who's already got 15 years of experience in cybersecurity to help out some immediate needs? And how does that fit into your budget? Now, obviously, as we discussed, we're not considering staffing in the budget, but it's something that is a consideration for this. And along with that, the work from home changes, how does that going to affect the budget? If last year, the pandemic sort of happened in first quarter, second quarter really blew up. So the budgets that you set out in the last quarter of maybe 2019 that were to take effect in 2020, if you're on a calendar year, may have changed. We saw cybersecurity and IT needs, and especially in the DR business, digital transformation and whatnot, that went skewed just skewed off the chart for remote access and changing the way that people access data. So that's a big challenge, a big consideration there is, what happens if that were to happen again? What do you do in those situations? When you're evaluating any type of a plan, proposal, policy, you want to look at experience. You want to see what's current, what's in the news, what's happened to you before. One, to make sure that it doesn't happen again, but so you don't trip over the same roadblocks. Jason talked about having a couple of situations with customers that have been hit recently, and ironically, we've had two as well in the past 2 weeks, and we're not just making this up. Our customers were hit by very similar variants of ransomware, and it happened because they were able to scrape elevated credentials out of memory. Basically, they lured somebody onto a malicious website, scraped the credentials, and had their way with the network. So because of that, and this is where it gets kind of scary, right? Jason was talking about disaster recovery and having good backups, but these bad actors know where to go first to get what they want. Their intentions are to secure your data so that they can get money from you. That's why it's called ransomware. And to do that, a lot of times they will go after your backups first. They're familiar with every kind of backup that's on the market today. Obviously, they're more familiar with some of the bigger ones. But everything has a file extension. Every situation is going to have some type of software on it. So they'll go look at those, look for those. If they have access to main admin access, they can access the systems on your network via PowerShell or whatnot. They will go and they will attempt to lock down your backup files so that you can't restore. If they can't lock those files down, guess what they do? They delete them, right? Because they have access to your backup servers and your backup software, guess what they can also navigate to? Your cloud backups, your offsite backups, your disaster recovery environments, where they again try to encrypt those. They can't encrypt those, they delete them. So we've actually had both of our customers that were recently had no backups. They couldn't access most of the systems on their network. One of them couldn't even log into their VMware environment. They couldn't access the internet. And we basically were able to rescue them with some special sauce that we put into our disaster recovery. We have, some gapped environments where we take that, copy that data, but it wiped out their entire environment. So you want to look at current, past, familiar threats. And I like the solution that, Jason describes with sort of a familiar thing, like what's in the news, what are other people seeing, and maybe examples of crowdsourcing. So you're not only relying on what you know today, you're relying on what other people have seen. Jason, can you talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, and that is why there's an emphasis on automated security responses today, is because of what we're seeing with a fast-paced moving target with the criminal behavior. They get in, they scrape credentials. They already have their scripts lined up and ready to go. They have their toolkit, so to speak, ready to go. So you need to have your toolkit and your responses ready to go as well, that when an account is compromised or you see activity on a machine that is bad behavior or it's anomalous behavior, that you're able to neutralize that activity very, very quickly. And that's extremely important. That plays well into, Kelly, I wanted to ask you if you just kind of go over some existing brands really quick, and then we could sort of move on to the execution and implementation.
Yeah. My thought around this was, we kind of, as organizations, get, I don't want to say sucked into, but we get used to the products that we have. We become very brand familiar, and we invest heavily in a specific type of brand of hardware or software or solution. And it becomes pretty familiar. And Jason mentioned, are your tools able to adapt? Are they able to handle threats of today? Or are you just trying to put a new sole on an old shoe? I've seen time and time again, and part of my example from a minute ago was somebody using one of the higher tier endpoint or EDR solutions that just didn't have, automatic script detection and deterrence enabled. So the question that I always have is, do you go with what you know and what you're hoping will work, or do you look at new products? Do you look at enabling that, and how does that work?
Yeah.
Whoops.
Sort of lost the screen there for a second, Nick. Cool. So when thinking about that, when you're looking at products, when you're looking at and evaluating your situation, your budget, what I want to lead you to here is execution and implementation. There's a couple things. When you are evaluating the products and you're evaluating your current product and its feature functionality and the dollars that you have, I would encourage you not to go for a one-to-one or a like budget. You might say, you know what, we're spending X now, but we're only getting X. You may need to look at spending a new dollar amount. Could be upper, could be increased, it could be decreased. But you need to be looking at feature functionality first and the ability to execute with the team that you have and be able to implement. So what I would say is you might be needing to pay a little bit more. I'm not encouraging it, but I'm saying sometimes that's the case. But you might get more feature functionality, and you may even be able to have that company, or if it's an MSSP, or it's a company that's a subject matter expert on this, they may be able to help implement that product. They also may be able to bring a subject matter expertise to the table and help you with best practices, proper configurations, and lead and guide you to the right configurations for your environment comparatively to other clients that they have seen, and bring practices to you that you might not have been able to do yourself. So that leads into cybersecurity insurance. Everybody needs to have cybersecurity insurance today, but here's the other thing is we all have car insurance. Now, we don't drive more recklessly because we have car insurance. So what I would encourage you is that, yes, you have cybersecurity insurance, but don't lean on it the exact same way, right? We all drive safe. We're not out there, driving crazily because we have car insurance. So what I would say is the cybersecurity insurance that we've seen and we've have experience with is yes, they're going to be there with the dollars and some expertise, but you still need to be taking the proper precautions. We have started to see underwriters and carriers step back and maybe even not insure or have a huge increase in a premium policy if you're not taking the proper precautions that you should in implementing some best practices. So that's what I would say on the cybersecurity insurance.
It's interesting, Jason. I actually had a customer 2 days ago tell me that their cybersecurity insurance underwriter required proof of their offsite backup strategy and what that did and how that protected, against these types of attacks.
Yeah, you have to keep in mind that cybersecurity insurance companies are in it to make money. They are an insurance company, but they are in it to be profitable as well.
Yep. So, you talked about consulting with people. I'm a smart guy. You're a smart guy. Things change. Things are different. People have their specialties. I personally believe, we need to talk to people who are experts, who have different opinions. This is why we do these types of exercises too, to get different insight. The more we stay in a situation, the harder it is to change and adapt, especially budgets, equipment, et cetera. And Jason, you have these low-hanging fruit here. Is there anything else that you think first would be something good for people to look at?
And I'm just trying to encourage a few tactical giveaways here. You've been part of our webinar today, and you've taken the time out of your day. I wanted to make sure that you walked away with some items that are high value. Things like having multi-factor authentication enabled on at least your IT admins and the people that have truly keys to the kingdom inside of your environment, vulnerability scanning and a patch management program, as well as really, if you haven't yet today, taking the local admin privileges away from standard users. Gets back to role-based access control, or that zero trust that even Kelly and I have talked about, is just making sure that standard users only have standard privileges and they do not have local admin privileges. And then visibility to not only email, phishing, and spear phishing in the environment. It is still the #1 way that criminals penetrate an environment is through email first.
Yeah.
And with that, I'd love to share with you, we have put together what we're calling a insider's configuration guide for email. One of the major lifts that we're able to bring to some of our clients is something like this, where we have gone through the email settings, whether you're an Office 365 or Google Gmail or potentially even something else. We are giving away this guide. So we'd ask for you to reach out to us at guide@bitlyft.com, and we will send you, it is a PDF. And we're even happy if you want more information and you want to discuss what's inside the PDF. We're happy to get on a call like this and walk you through something. We would just love to see people be more secure with their email where they're at today. So there's nothing to pay for here. It's just something we want to give to you and get your email practices better secured.
This is great. Well, thank you guys both for sharing. This is where we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have a particular question, you can go ahead and throw your hand up with the Zoom feature, and we can bring you off mute if you want to ask direct, or go ahead and put that in the chat, and we can get that question over to Kelly and Jason. I do have one question here while people are writing in. One of the questions is, if my budget isn't this large at 625,000, what is it essential to do first?
Yeah, Jason, I'll let you start with that one.
Yeah, so if your budget's not that large and you need to have some place to start, I would start with MFA. A lot of Office 365 and Google Gmail offer a entry level multi-factor authentication included in their price. So it is a great way to get started without spending a lot of dollars. I think the second thing that I would probably focus in on would be that endpoint EDR solution, and having a best practices proper configuration with the EDR solution, simply because if they get past some of the first initial layers of your security, you can then start to rely on your EDR solution in place.
Yeah, and then I'll just add on to that. One of the simplest, often most overlooked because it's boring, is your backups, your disaster recovery plan. Get a copy of that stuff off site, protect it however you can, because sometimes that's going to be your last stand against these types of things, and to be able to recover your business. So definitely don't want to forget about that.
Yeah, that's great. And another question we had is revolved around leaderships and budgets. Question is, how do you formulate the budgets with your leadership team to see the severity of cybersecurity? So how would you go about building that leadership support around budgets?
I think this is where the news really helps. You get a little bit of that fear factor when you read the news and you see who gets hit, who's attacked. Sometimes you actually see the ransoms that are paid. I sort of like the side of it where you can talk to other people and find out what they've been through. So the news and the media actually help with that. And you're not just coming up with some type of information because it's a word, it's a buzzword, something like that. It's actually, this is what is happening. This is what we've seen. Talk to companies and people like Global Data Vault or BitLyft and get experiences. We're happy to talk to people all the time, even just to help people understand, because there's people out there that don't understand. They still don't realize the impact that something like this can have on their organization.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, that question, what we have seen be very successful in the C-suite and the IT managers getting involved with the budget design and the purposes behind those budget dollars, getting everybody involved, removing the jargon, the IT jargon from the conversation, and talk about what is the business doing, what is the business going after, and how IT is going to enable the business to stay operational and to keep it safe at the same time. If you involve leadership in these conversations and you speak to them and they removing the jargon and the acronyms out of the conversation, I have seen a much better buy-in and a much better levelness experienced across that table. I have been a part of many conversations where the CFO and the CEO are involved. And when you express to them risk and you express to them that we don't do these things, these are the elements that we are signing up for along the way. And if they understand the journey and they understand the risk, then they're better equipped to help you with allocating the dollars that are available out of the budget.
Great. And then we've got time for about one more question. And one I've got here is, if you only had to do one thing, or you only could do one thing on this list, which would it be first? And this question is for both of you.
I mean, obviously, I'm going to say get your backups off site. You know, we did a webinar Data Vault a little while back about the disaster recovery plan. This sort of encapsulates a lot of the things that Jason mentioned with testing your backups, making sure that things are working appropriately. It goes along with that. You know, make sure you have backups, make sure that you test them, make sure that you get the data offsite.
Yeah, and what I would say there is I agree. I'm not disagreeing with what Kelly's doing, but if I only had one thing that I could choose from, it would be MFA. Multi-factor authentication, we have seen it be enabled on banks, on your credit cards, personally and business-wise. And multi-factor authentication helps reduce and it helps validate the intended user has control over the account, and you have now validated the account and the user. If you're getting text messages or the 6-digit code sent to you and you're not trying to access it, you now know you're in trouble. And those are the indicators that you now need to go and pay attention. Either my email address is compromised, or somebody knows the username to my bank or my environment, and they're trying to get in. I now need to go and pay attention to that. I need to go change some things. So there's going to be indicators of activity there that are going to put you on the right direction. So I would lean towards MFA.
All right. Well, with that, that concludes our webinar for today. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us. And again, email us at guide@bitlyft.com if you want those insider's guide for email 365. Kelly, Jason, thanks for taking the time. Thanks for putting together these budgets. Appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.